I want to start this morning with an unusual question. Have you ever had a vision of something? Have you ever seen something that you think you should not have seen, or that's not possible to see? We hear stories about these types of events, that people see things and have experiences with people from beyond the grave, for instance. The dead come back and speak to them, or they have visions of people who've passed away. And I must admit that I'm a skeptic. When I hear these stories, I doubt. I think it's probably not true. It's something that has gone on, some other reason we can explain it some way. It becomes a little bit more difficult to be a skeptic, though, when you find other people in your lives who you also have a long experience with, and you know that they are skeptics, maybe even more skeptical than you are, who claim to have had such experiences. I have an example. A trusted friend of mine who I would classify as not being at all sympathetic to visions and spiritual encounters in this way, described to me that one morning he woke up early because he sensed something unusual in his room. And he looked at the foot of his bed, and there he saw his deceased mother standing. And he said it wasn't frightening, it wasn't terrifying, she didn't look ghostly, she didn't look like some decayed phantom. He said she was beautiful, and he said it was as real as seeing anybody else. He told me that he knew it wasn't a dream. He said, I was awake. He said, I know that I was awake. It wasn't I was dreaming this. I was awake and I saw her. And he claims without a doubt that this is what he's experienced. He himself tried to explain it away, but he found it difficult to deny the reality of the experience that he had. And of course, me being a skeptic myself, I confess that I wanted to explain away his experience too. But it's impossible to explain away somebody else's experience. I can't do that. I may doubt, I may question, I may ask questions that helped us to understand what happened, but in the end, it's very difficult, indeed impossible, for someone to discount entirely the experience of somebody else. These stories of visions, of encounters with spiritual beings, with angels, with demons, are the foundation of most religious traditions across the world. And I think that you can think of several examples across various religions. Of course, the monotheistic religions are filled with these types of visions. Judaism, Christianity, Islam are all rooted in the interaction of the spirit world, God himself, and angels in the lives of humanity. Not only in this, but even in non-monotheistic traditions, you find revelations in meetings with supernatural beings. In fact, the birth story of the Buddha tells of his mother having a dream being transported by angelic beings to a particular area where she was impregnated with the Buddha, and also with visions and the spiritual beings coming and interacting with humanity. This is part of the Buddhist tradition also. Are all these experiences figments of people's imagination? It's not an isolated event. In fact, there's claims throughout history, going back thousands of years, of people having these types of visions, having these types of experiences. And it's not in one particular religious tradition. It's not in one particular area of the world. It's a common expression of humanity that we find replicated and duplicated elsewhere. What do we do with these things? Are there any substantive differences between these experiences? One religion, for instance, says that God revealed something to this person. Another religion says that God revealed something to this person. And the reason why we believe that one is true and the other is true, or that one is false and that one is false, is because of our own experience. Most people would say the reason why I'm a Christian is I grew up in America. Well, there's a lot of people who've grown up in America who are not Christians. But it's even worse for me. I grew up in church. I'll make it even worse for me. My father is a pastor. I had no hope of not being a Christian, is what most people would look at me and say of course he was going to be a Christian. But if I was born in Iran, to Muslim parents, I'd be a Muslim. If I was born in Jerusalem, to Jewish parents, I'd be a Jew. So people tell us that the reason why we are what we are is simply a product of the environment that we've grown up in. And there's a certain degree of truth in that statement. It's undeniable. Our circumstances influence the way we think and influence the things that we pursue and the way we believe. Indeed, I think it applies to many people. But it does not address all the possibilities. Some people, for instance, are so captivated by questions related to the existence and nature of God, to the development of the ideas around who God is, to the practice of religious traditions in their attempt to know God, that they devote themselves seriously to looking into those matters. It's not simply I was born this way or I was born in this environment, but there's something in them that drives them to say, I want to analyze this and figure out why I am what I am, why I believe what I believe, and not simply rely upon what my background is and what I've been told since I was a child. For some people, they're pushed towards even more. In doing so, and examining our religious traditions and comparing them to other religious traditions, we find similarities. We find commonalities that all humans go through, visions, for instance, dreams, throughout all religious traditions. We also find distinct differences. It's an easy thing for the skeptic to say, all religions are essentially the same. It's much more difficult to prove that. It's easy to hear people, they say, oh, it really doesn't matter because they're all basically the same. But any one of us who's begun to pursue and ask deeper questions quickly realizes that there are some substantial differences in these different approaches to who God is, and it leaves us with some type of a dilemma. I can say this by experience. I've devoted much of my life, I may say my whole life, to religious studies, and it's not just as a pastor. It's a profession that I hold outside of the church. And the more that I read and the more that I explore, to be honest with you, the more complicated the issues become. Contrary to what I was told when I was a kid, the more you explore, it actually becomes clearer. However, complications, questions, uncertainties, doubts are not the same as lack of faith. And there doesn't need to be, it's not required that there's a direct relationship between the two. That an uncertainty and a doubt automatically leads to unbelief. In many ways, many ways, I have more doubts about aspects of my faith now than I've ever had my whole life. My faith as a child was strong, was simple, couldn't be wavered. But then I got a little older, and I started scratching some more and asking more questions, and doubts started to creep in, and questions started to arise, and I started to explore more. And in fact, there are aspects of my faith now that I question and that I doubt regularly, and I struggle with all the time. At the same time, there are aspects of my faith that have never been more secure than they are right now. More so than when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid, I believed certain things about who God is, who Jesus is, and the story of the gospel. I believed them. But I could not articulate them in a way that expressed what I really believed. And I can do that now. So I found ways in which I've become stronger in my faith, and I found ways in which I've become weaker in my faith. And what I want to propose to you this morning is that these two poles are not adversarial. They don't work against one another. You can find yourself, as we find ourselves in many aspects of our lives, living in the dilemma. Doubting and not doubting. Believing and not believing. Struggling and feeling entirely confident. These two poles don't necessarily work against one another. In fact, I think they are the honest wranglings of a person attempting to know the being that is behind all of this. For the unbeliever, I'll add, if there is even a being behind all of this. How do we process our doubt? Is it allowed? In what aspects of faith is it allowed? What about in the most central aspects of your faith? What about doubts about the resurrection? Can you be a believer and doubt that Jesus Christ rose again from the dead? Can you be a believer and struggle that maybe what we have is a story of visions like we have from all these other traditions? And something happened there that we can find parallels in other places? Where does faith end and unbelief begin, or vice versa? When I find myself thinking about the resurrection, thinking deeply about it, like during the Easter season, it seems pretty unbelievable. And what we are dealing with in this story is the story of the unbelievable. And while I struggle at times grasping this because of my own skepticism, because I haven't seen this worked out in my life, I haven't seen anybody else rise again from the dead, I find a certain consolation that I'm not the only one who's gone through it. Not that it resolves all my questions, not that the fact that misery loves company, or that I have other people with me in this pathway. In fact, you may find that if you hang out with people who are doubters, it increases your doubt. If you hang out with people who are not doubters, it may increase your faith. But once again, is that objective truth, or is that just subjective in the people you choose to hang out with? When we look at these passages in the New Testament, what we find about in the resurrection is a group of people who also struggled with being uncertain that Jesus actually rose again from the dead, who doubted that it was true. We see it multiple times. Some of these people actually, and you look at the stories of the Gospels tells us that some of them had visions of angels before. Some of them, Peter, James, and John, saw Jesus transfigured, changed on the Mount of Transfiguration. In other words, they had a vision of Jesus in a way they had never seen him before. So in other words, some of these people that we're going to read about now already had interactions with the supernatural world. And the 21st century argument, or the 20th century argument, the modernist argument would be that people in the first century just had a proclivity. They had a tendency to believe in these things because they weren't as refined as we are. In fact, people will say, people used to believe that the sun was a god and it would come and go throughout a particular cycle within the day. And we know that that's not true anymore. People back in the first century, people in ancient times, they believed all these types of crazy stories. It doesn't mean that they're true. But what I find compelling here is that we have a group of people who don't believe, just like I don't believe at times, who are able to distinguish between a vision in a dream and what they've seen in Jesus. And they say it is something substantively different. I can't do that because I've never had a vision of a dead person outside of what I've known is in my dreams, and I've never seen somebody rise again from the dead. So I have no experiential background to make that assessment. Where does that leave me? You may say it leaves me hopeless. I hope not. But it does present some serious challenges for us. I want to read 4 accounts of doubters in the New Testament. They're not very long passages. I want you to focus on the aspect of doubt in each one of these passages. The first one comes from the first gospel, Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 to 18, where it says this: Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. 3 words in our English translation. Some doubted. Nothing more than that. We don't know how they doubted. What did they doubt? We don't know, but we know they doubted. Mark chapter 16, verse 9 through 16. Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive, and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After these things, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Afterward, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. I confess that if I was in this group, I probably would have been rebuked by Jesus. I probably would have been with that group. Luke 24, and that was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles, but these words seemed to them as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, We have seen the Lord. But he said to them, Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. Certainly. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, Peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, Put your finger here, and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered, My Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. We see doubt in each one of these accounts. Why do you think they would doubt? There could be several reasons. Number one, natural skepticism to the possibility that someone comes back from the dead. They're first century people, but they know dead is dead. Martha told Jesus when Lazarus died, she said, if you had been here before, he would still be alive. But now he's dead for 4 days. Basically what she's saying is, I had faith that if there's still a little bit of life in him, you could have done something with him. But once life is gone from him, nobody can do anything. There's nothing to work with, is what she's saying. Dead is dead. First century people understood death better, I think, than we understand death. They had to take care of dead bodies themselves, their families. They had to prepare them. They didn't turn them over to somebody else, as we find in some cultures. They couldn't embalm them and preserve them for longer periods of time so that they could wait until families come from around the world, and then they could have the burial. That's why they buried them quickly. It was part of regular life. They knew dead, and Jesus was dead. I think one of the reasons why they doubted is because of this natural skepticism. I also think that we saw a couple of weeks ago, their preoccupation with their own issues may have kept them from believing that Jesus Christ had risen again from the dead. We saw this with the disciples in Mark 8, 9, and 10, that they were preoccupied with their own goals of being successor, that it seems to have clouded what Jesus told them was going to happen. Each time, for instance, Jesus prophesied that he was going to rise again from the dead, we find some type of story or statement about the disciples asking, who's the greatest? And we said, where's what's going on with these guys, that there's this disconnect between Jesus saying, I'm going to rise again from the dead, and them saying, who's going to be greatest? How can you follow this up with that? Doesn't make any sense to us. So maybe the fact that they're preoccupied with their own issues kept them from believing that Jesus rose again from the dead. Maybe the expectation of the kingdom of God coming in Jesus, as we've seen already here in some of these passages, that the resurrection that Jesus spoke about was a description of the end of times and the ultimate resurrection of all people. And so they didn't expect Jesus' resurrection to happen, but that it was to usher in the end of times. This is what we see in the lives of the disciples throughout the Gospels. And in fact, when Jesus, you might say, but Jesus said that he would rise again in 3 days. During the week, go read these passages. And you'll see that this expression, 3 days, is often used as an indefinite time period, which just means a short period. I'll be with you in a minute. Give me a second. Right? We say, give me a second here in Lebanon. We show up an hour later. Right? It's just a general statement that we use in language. 3 days can be used the same way. So when Jesus told his disciples that he was going to rise again in 3 days, did they expect 3 days, or did they expect some short time? In fact, even after he rose again from the dead, and he rose and he ascended into heaven, his disciples still believed that within a short time he was going to return. And here we are 2,000 years later, still waiting. The disciples struggled with the claims that Jesus rose from the dead. They doubted like you do. They questioned like I do. You're not any different than the disciples, than skeptics throughout history. But the story of the resurrection has elements in it that suggest to us that the account as it's told to us is real. We've come across these over the past few weeks. We saw last week that the story the disciples told is not a story that somebody would make up if they're trying to convince others that this is true. And I argued because of that, it doesn't prove 100% that the story is true, but it should cause us to question, should cause us to ask, why would they fabricate this story? This is one of the accusations made against the resurrection story. It's just a fabrication of later disciples. But when they make women the primary testimony to the resurrection, it goes contrary to anything that would have been accepted in their day. It's the worst apologetic fabrication you could possibly come up with if you're a first century writer, because nobody's going to believe them. Even the disciples didn't believe them. Even the ones who knew them and followed with them, Jesus, disbelieved them. Imagine what the world, the Jews and the Romans around them would say. That's your evidence? So we start looking at the story from this broader perspective, and it begins to challenge what we believe and what we don't believe. The resurrection prompted them to affirm that Jesus, ultimately, as Thomas did, was Lord and God, as Stephen did and went to his death, as Peter did, as James, the brother of Jesus, who at one point doubted while he was alive, but then believed, as Paul, who persecuted the church, but then also saw Jesus and believed. But what is evident here is that they were not more open to the possibility of the resurrection than we are. Their change was not also from having seen some apparition, some vision, because they knew the difference. The disciples claimed, for instance, to have eaten and talked with Jesus. They were convinced that it was not a vision, not a dream. However, you can find many accounts of people who have claimed that they have eaten and talked with the dead. And Christians historically have dismissed those as not being valid. But the question is, the arguments that we use against those stories can be turned back on us, can be turned back on the Christian. What's the difference between these stories? Why is this true and that one's false? In the end, the claim of the disciples that they saw Jesus and they sat with him and they talked with him and they ate with him is not sufficient definitive proof. It's not evidence. It's not something that removes all doubt. My point lies here. The claims of the disciples alone do not guarantee the physical resurrection of Jesus. But for the one who is humble, for the one who's willing to believe, these accounts give added evidence to the story in general. What do we know, for instance, so far from our series? Well, the first day of the week, the day of Jesus' crucifixion, changed many things in the lives of many people and set the stage for changes that have influenced all of humanity. What can we say definitively? That we have an empty tomb. First off, that Jesus was crucified. I think that's pretty well established. We even have outside sources telling us that Jesus was crucified. We have an empty tomb. We have claims that some of Jesus' followers saw him and interacted with him. No one of these points alone can prove to us this morning that Jesus' resurrection was a historical fact. But the combination of them can help in removing doubt to the one whose heart is open to God. Jesus himself recognized this when he said to Thomas, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Let me ask you this morning, what do you say about the resurrection? Do you doubt? Do you dismiss these stories as apparitions, as visions? You're not alone. Many have, and many will. Do you struggle with the reality of the resurrection? You're not alone. Many have, many will. If so, one bit of consolation is that you are not alone. That maybe if you were one of the immediate disciples of Jesus, you would have been in the exact same position that they are in. But something changed for them. The evidence before them was so compelling that it changed them. And while their account of seeing Jesus cannot convince you that it's true, it's one more block in a structure being built around the truth of the Gospels and the truth of who Jesus is, and that he has come back from the dead to bring us life. I've changed many things in my beliefs over the years, and I'll continue to struggle with aspects of my faith. If you were to ask me then, why do I believe? Let me tell you why I believe. Because the accounts that we read give me enough in terms of history that I can resolve my doubts. They don't answer every question that I have. I still struggle with aspects of the stories, but they give me enough that I can say, my faith is not unreasonable. My faith doesn't not make sense. There's a sense to it. And many people have made the same argument throughout history. It gives me that much. Because the life of Jesus, number 2, best reflects to me who I believe God is. That when I look at Jesus and I look at everybody else that I've studied, some well, some not as well, but when I look at Jesus, he reflects to me who I believe God really is. A God of love, a being of mercy, a being of justice and fairness to all, a spiritually pure being, a physically pure person, Jesus. These reflect to me who I believe God is. Number 3, because the theology of Jesus in the Bible reflects best to me what I see in the world around me. Brokenness, with the need for restoration. Restoration that can only come from outside, that can't be generated from within me, because I've tried to generate it within me and I can't attain it. So my my lived experience is one that I look at the theology that's laid out for Jesus gives me and what's found among the early believers, and I say, yes, this fits what I experience, what many others have experienced, and what the world reflects. And that's one more building block in my structure of faith. Because there's a spiritual experience that I have of peace and connection to God that has come to me as I've humbled myself to the only one who can fix me. My last point. Why do I believe? It's a combination of all those. Why do Christians believe that Jesus Christ rose again from the dead? Not only because the tomb was empty, because somebody may say they came and they stole his body. Somebody may provide a counter-argument to the empty tomb. Christians don't only believe that Jesus Christ rose again from the dead because his disciples, said that they interacted with him, because we find the accounts of this in many traditions. What makes that any different than what we believe, than what other people believe? And so even if that's true, why should I believe this as opposed to that? It's still not a final argument. Christians argue that the reason why we believe this whole story to be true is because it seems too fantastic to fabricate, and they wouldn't fabricate it in the way that they did. Well, maybe they would. People do some weird things. And maybe while it doesn't make sense to us, and nobody would, I think my argument, and many smarter than I have made the same argument, that this is not the type of story you would fabricate. You wouldn't fabricate it in this way. I find that to be a strong argument for me. But if my faith is based on that alone, I'm not going to manage my faith. It's going to fall apart. My faith is not based on those arguments. It's based on the history is enough for me to say, yes, I can believe this and not be crazy and not be delusional. But it's more than that. It's who Jesus is and what his nature is. It's what the Bible tells me about my condition and who God is. It's my own experience with the Spirit of God working in my life and bringing peace. All of these brought together give me faith. If I took any single one of these and argued that they're the sole reason for my faith would not stand. And the same works for the first day of the week. Some people, however, become so engaged, even when they doubt, in wanting to know who God is, that they pursue him. They say, I have these doubts, but I want to know. And in doing so, those of us who pursue come to realize that indeed God is pursuing us. That he's seeking out for us. Jesus said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Are you ready this morning to become one of those whom he is talking about? Are you ready this morning to say, I have all these doubts and these uncertainties and I'm not sure. But when I look at it in its totality, I have a peace that this is who God is and where I should be. Are you willing this morning to make that decision? I pray that today would be the day that you decide that you're going to follow Jesus, not because you can answer all the questions, but because he offers to you something that you have not found and can't find anyplace else. And it's a combination of all these factors that he's working in your life, just as he does in mine. And what he does in your life is different than what he does in mine. But at the same time, it's astoundingly similar. I pray that all of us approach this and we look at it and say, that's unbelievable. But in the process of making that statement, that's unbelievable, somehow we find belief. Our Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning, we ask that you would change our lives and change our hearts and help us to know you, help us to submit ourselves to you, Lord, and to trust that through many avenues, through the work of your Spirit in our lives, through our diligent study, through questioning, through all of these avenues, you are drawing us to yourself. Help us to see your hand. And Lord, I pray that we would all be humble enough this morning to submit to you and ask you, Lord Jesus, to be our Lord, our Savior, and our God. We ask this all in Christ's name.